Hey, what's up, guys? Lucas Burnley here, along with my co host, TJ Schwartz. You are listening to the Edge and Flow podcast. So, TJ and I have been going over what we wanted to talk about today, and we've got something that is kind of prickly, but it's on our minds, and we figure might as well just have a discussion around it and kind of see where it goes. So,
Yeah.
TJ, what are we talking about, man?
Yeah. So certain things have happened in the industry very, very recently this week, really, as far as what people have been talking about. But this is a very big conversation. And so I think we should frame it as a big conversation and not just about what happened this week. But
Kind of
this week,
catalyst leading
yeah,
into conversation, right?
yeah,
All right.
exactly.
So what is the catalyst?
So this week, it was brought. It's not a new phenomenon, but it was brought to my attention and your attention and many people's attention. A particular company. Do we name the company?
Yeah, I think
Yeah. Okay.
honestly, it gives context.
Yeah. Williams Knife Co. Believe out of South Carolina ish, something like that.
Yep, sounds right.
Posting pictures on their Instagram about their high quality original knives that they're quote unquote making, and they are direct copies of designs of mine, of designs of the James brand, of designs of uh,
Brian Efros.
Brian Efros.
Yep,
Seems like there's maybe others,
yep,
but regardless, there is a catalog of knives that are being marketed by this company as original designs that are absolutely not. And it's part of the conversation today is what is a copy and what's a clone, et cetera. But these are one to one replicas in a
yeah.
sense.
Well, and that's like a big question, right? Like around this kind of like intellectual property that is not copyrighted, not patented, like minor changes can be made. And like, where as designers do we look at something and say like that is too close, or are you able to see like the lineage? Everyone is inspired by work, and that's not what we're talking about. I think you and I both have the general overview that like not even acknowledging when something is copied is like usually the best case. Like I've always said, like lead or follow. Like I
Mhm.
know that if I have a successful design, there's going to be some amount of people that take either large like elements from it, right, and
Mhm.
kind of rearrange it, or just kind of copy it
Yeah.
in whatever way they see fit. Like the Kwaiken was the first knife that really happened with. And at first, like it's hard, right? Like you see kind of something getting diluted as you go on. You just realize, like, look, I would rather have people with like taking my old ideas, and I just need to keep working on new stuff. But I feel like there is some criteria around this that can give guidance and like, I don't know, just like show a little bit of the process of like how are you respectful as a designer while still being inspired by
Yeah.
others' work.
Yeah. And it's just generally the conversation of intellectual property and what does that mean?
Right.
Is kind of the macro here. But in this instance, it was not using like emblems, imagery, or trademarks
Right.
that were of the knives that they
So it's
were.
not a counterfeit.
Yeah, it's not a
Okay.
counterfeit, and I've heard the word clone, and I've used the word clone,
Yep.
and some people use the word clone, and they're referring to knives that have the same logoing and marking in an effort to be a counterfeit. Would you
Right.
say a clone and a counterfeit is that the same term?
I use them a little bit differently. To me, a counterfeit is presented as something it is not. A clone in my context is a knife that is like basically a one-to-one recreation, but branded as something else. And
Yeah.
looking at this, when we started looking at the photos, what I saw is the most like logical kind of conclusion was that this company probably went overseas, went to a manufacturer, and bought knives to have badged as their own branded knives.
Mhm.
Not a problem, right?
Mhm.
The problem usually arises when someone doesn't have an oversight of the industry and they don't realize that they are buying a clone of another maker's design.
Yeah.
Okay. We see this on kind of the fringes of the industry. So if you are a knife company who exists like primarily in like the hunting or outdoor space where you're dealing with different distributors, you're not necessarily like familiar with the designers or like main companies, it's easy to do this.
Mm-hmm.
They would not be the first brand that this has happened to by a long shot. My issue arises around how they've handled the situation, which
Exactly.
is every designer or maker that has reached out to them, they have refused to respond to, and they've blocked. That to me shows like malicious intent,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Not only the willingness to sell and peddle like essentially copyright, not literal copyright infringement, but it's in a sense like infringement on the intellectual property of these designs, but then to also try to shelf them or like push away anybody that's questioning them in a way that's like, I don't know. I'm struggling with the words right now, but I guess
Well,
it's the way they're hiding from it.
yeah, to have a conversation with someone who is being reasonable. Like if a maker reaches out and says, "Hey, this design that you have is my design," right? And there's no response, and then they block you, that's a problem.
Hmm.
It would seem after doing some like kind of digging that this is an ongoing problem. So you and I both discussed whether we wanted to like mention the company. In this context, for me, it's actually less about the company themselves and more about like kind of educating people around this process of like, I don't know, some of the ins and outs of like, look, it's, you will see online like people will comment like, well, it's not patented or it's not trademarked. I realize that from like a legal standpoint, like they're completely right.
Hmm.
You and I like came up in an industry where there's like a large amount of respect for other people's um, IP, right?
Yeah,
Intellectual
yeah.
property. You respect the designs, you know the history. Like we're careful, like you try to know like where details or elements of certain designs originate.
Hmm.
So the conversation we're having here is kind of twofold. Like it's not a legal conversation. Like no one is
Yeah,
going to go after a company and be like, "You copied my knife. I'm going after you,"
right.
unless it's something that is like a patented feature,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's usually at the mass production scale.
right.
Right? Agreed.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to kind of prove your point that you'd made earlier about the way that this probably happened is I had a friend of mine who lives in Seattle and he was looking at kind of a boutique knife shop. And this is really common, similar to what you described, where it was obvious this boutique knife shop did the same thing where they wanted to have an in-house knife brand, hired a manufacturer to brand knives and designs that they let the manufacturer come up with and send them to them for them to sell as their own knife. Well, in that glass case that he sent me the video of was the same clone knife, the exact same and even the same colorway
Yep.
as the one that Williams Knife Co. was selling.
Right. As their
Um,
own unique design.
yeah, and so
Right.
because it was the same knife, it's like it validates the point you've made that it was
Yeah.
like the source of the actual infringement was upstream.
Right.
But again, it's like it's all about when first contact is made. Like for example, if I were to reach out to Williams Knife Co., like how is that handled
Right.
is ultimately what matters. And you mentioned people getting blocked. I had a essentially what happened to me is people kept bringing this up to me because it kind of became like a fever pitch
It's
in
a
the
very
industry.
recognizable design, right? It's two designs,
Yeah,
right?
and people were bringing it up to me. I usually ignore clones. That's another thing we can dive into after this is like what we do about it.
Yep.
But I usually ignore them. And then this time there was so many people bringing it up to me, and I kept going back to this Williams Knife Co. Instagram feed to like just look at it and see what people were commenting, etc. And at one time I went back to it and I was blocked, and I had not reached out. I hadn't done anything or said anything. It
Right.
was
You'd
just that
never commented on a post.
exactly. So it was people claiming that they were, they were infringing on my designs,
Right.
made them block me without me being involved.
You as the
Um,
designer without
yeah,
them ever having reached
yeah,
out.
yeah.
Right.
So
To me, that is absolutely nuts.
yeah, yeah,
Right. That is just like a willful disregard to have any kind of open communication.
hmm,
And this is where I think I really start to have a problem, right? Which is just because you don't understand how something works or the rules of like how the relationships in our kind of like field work doesn't give you a pass to just take advantage of whoever
Yeah.
you want and think that it's fine. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So ultimately, like when we look at them as a company, what I see is I see that they work with like some pretty legitimate like retailers, right? Like they work with Flylords, they work with Grundens, I mean, they're in the outdoor space.
Mhm.
My theory on this one with the designers, I think they've been doing it for a long time, but my theory is that because of who they decided, or even if it wasn't a willful decision to do it, the copied knives, the clones that they have in their catalog right now, I feel like they may have like drastically overstepped,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Because you
Yeah.
have everything from two well-known brands. Okay. So you have James brand, and is the model your Torrent
The Torrent, which I designed for Millet Knives and
and
CRKT,
CRKT.
both make the same
So
design.
right.
Yeah.
So they're now this company has a clone of a knife that is designed by you and manufactured by CRKT as a collaboration.
Mhm.
And they also have a one-to-one clone of a James brand knife. And the
Yeah.
thing is, these are not really like debatable like
Yeah.
elements. Like these are very unique designs with very unique design language and a history of like the the process of them being released into the world.
Yeah.
Like for them to say like, "Oh, this is our design," like you're lying. It doesn't work because like you can go back and you can see like where you were designing this knife in Instagram
Yeah.
probably 4 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. That and
It's a really bad position to be in.
it is. It really is. And it's that and so we can also dive into like there's designs that are derivations of other designs and that
Totally.
are like there's not a lot of effort going into creating these things that are in reality just they aren't new.
Right.
That's fine. I'm a knife designer, so I look at a knife and I think about how original it is and how new it is and like how it makes me feel looking at it, having seen like so many knives in my life.
Right.
But if there's companies like let's say this company, they just want to serve a hunting community, a community that doesn't see knives every day. They don't want
Right.
something new and fresh. Like if they just wanted a derivative design that they could sell that has orange handles, we market it's for hunting.
Yep.
I'm fine with that, right? And
Yep.
and derivative designs, like it's not imaginative, it's not fresh, but it's also not completely
It's not a
unethical.
clone.
Yeah,
Well, okay, so let's get into this a little bit, right? Like there's a lot of tropes around this, like, good artists borrow, great artists steal. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Like there's all of these things. And we come like the knife industry in general is pretty community based. You're inspired by other people that you work with. There's working methods that actually lend themselves towards certain styles, right? So I think that this conversation essentially happens like in degrees, right? As a maker, you see another maker's knife and you're like, that is awesome. I wish I designed it, right?
yeah,
Everyone, I think, is inspired to a point where you're like, okay, like I love these lines. Like for me personally, right? I look at it from a context of like, what can I take that I like without ending up at the same, finish point.
right.
For me, I think that's what they mean, or like that's how I've always read the comment, like good artists borrow, great artists steal.
Yeah,
I think that the stolen elements are actually reused in a way that makes them fresh again,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
This is also a component of like the idea that like there's nothing new in the world. Like every knife that's been designed, the shape is there. There's probably a lot of accuracy in that, but we're talking about like individual design language. We're talking about like the way that all of these components come together for the finished product. Like when you look at the James brand knife that has been cloned, it's actually really unique. And it's
hmm
unique because it doesn't really have like what I would consider like a knife maker, knife designer feel. It feels like industrial design.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
The way that they used line, the way that they use scale, proportion, color, like it makes it unique. Whether or not like the profile shape of it is anything like special, when you look at it, you're like, it's instantly recognizable,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
right?
it's like designing for, some of these big brands like Apple,
Right.
computers. It's like you look at an Apple laptop, it's like from a kind of bird's eye view from 10 feet away. It's like it's still a laptop.
Yeah,
But then you look at like, oh, their charge port is the lightning port. They're not using
totally.
USB. They're doing this. They got rid of the headphone jack so they could make it thinner. Like it's flatter. It's got like bevels. Like it's the devil's in the details. I think we talk
Yeah,
about that all the time with design. Is like three people can make the same design in theory, like from a macro level, but in the details, like totally separate. And
right.
that's where I admire designers that can, because like we've talked about the knife fitting in the shape of your hand, and it's like
Sure.
everyone's hand is generally similar, so it's like the knives are going to end up looking similar. So how do you differentiate?
Right.
And that's kind of the job of the designer, and that's where when I see like derivative designs, it's like if you can you can derivate, I guess it is, with like effectiveness. And that's, I try not to operate too much like that, but like I can respect it. You know what I mean?
For
And
sure.
that's where with a company like this, like I would love to have a conversation with somebody operating in that way and just say like, you can still do semi derivative designs and still be like legit, right?
But
Like
the
you don't have to
problem
just
is they're not
copy.
they're not doing any design.
Yeah.
They're presenting it like they're doing design, but
Hmm.
they're not doing the creative work. They're not saying like, hey, let's change this, this, and this, and then we end up where we want, and it's not a clone. They're
Yeah.
not doing that, right?
Yeah.
I think that another with social media, like we see a lot as makers, like I've had all kinds of interesting things. I've made custom Quikens and had people write in that I'm copying the Boker Quiken, right?
Yeah.
So like we take for granted that okay, not everybody knows the history and not everybody is a huge nerd. Do you
Hmm.
think that as designers, like we're asking too much for people to be able to tell the difference between like, or let me reframe that. When you and I had the tuna and the Overland come out, right? With CRKT, we had the same colorway.
And they came out the same catalog year.
Came out in the same catalog and the same colorway. As a designer looking at those knives, they are very, very different, right? Like
Hmm.
the way that line is used, like the overall flow, like everything is different, but they were the same color. We both had a lot of people say, like, oh, is this like this knife related to this knife? Is this like, oh, this looks like a copy of this knife?
Hmm.
And when you and I look at it, like there are zero similarities other than just the color.
Right.
But people are seeing the color and maybe like a general size and going, oh, this is a copy or this is similar. That's never what we're talking about,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
It's like very, very specific details that start to like I've always said like, man, if I can look at a design and see where you changed two lines and like I end up back at my design, like that is very close.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it mean I'm gonna like go after you or call you out? Actually, no. But I can see it, and I think a lot of other people can see it too, right? So there's like an education process of like knowing the history, and maybe this is for us. Like this is what I consider like due diligence. We kind of have to know what's on the market. We kind of have to have some oversight as to like what's come before us, right?
That's right.
Just because it informs your work in an honest way.
And when it comes to like the customer perspective, I have to like self reflect a little bit because it's easy to get in the situation of like, I mean, this doesn't just apply to knives, right? It applies to everything. Like there's the original inventor, there's like the original manufacturer of most things, and then oftentimes there's the copies that flow behind any successful product.
Right.
And they could be derivations, they could be innovative in their own way, but then there's some that are just flat out copies. And so it's like if I'm going to buy something that isn't a knife, so I'm not, like you said, a nerd about that thing, and I see the same, what appears to me to be the same thing, and one's cheaper, like I do have to think to myself, like, to what degree do I put that on me to find the true source of that intellectual property and buy from them? Like, how
Totally. Yeah.
responsible am I? Because I have to put myself in the mindset of someone buying a knife who isn't a knife professional or expert, right?
Right.
And that's a good question. Like, what
Right.
do you think
And
about
and
that?
there's I mean there's big questions around this too. Like if you're going to buy, an Eames chair and you can't afford it at this point and you buy a cloned Eames chair, like, is there like a statute of limitations on this stuff? It's muddy. It's really,
Mm-hmm.
really muddy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think for myself, like, all things have their time. Um, this situation, like, you were very ready to kind of just like let it go,
Mm-hmm.
right? Realizing like in no way is it going to hurt your business. This one really stuck with me because it looked, it just looked so blatant. Like, hey, we know what's going on. We know these are other people's designs. We don't care. We're going to take them. We're going to block you. We're not going to have a conversation because you don't matter. And that bothers me,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? Like, I don't want to see that go unanswered.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, you start to ask the questions and like look at it from this kind of broader perspective. Like, we're not all making, but like we're all making frame locks,
Yeah.
right?
No, exactly.
Like,
And that's where it's like, because, Chris Reeve and Michael Walker kind of pioneered the frame and liner lock around the same
yep,
time. Do we now have to buy any frame and liner lock from them directly? It's like,
right,
that's a reach, right?
right.
But
So, and
where,
I look at it, I'm like, that's a feature, and that feature has been out a long time.
Mhm.
It's Is it open source? Like, is there a point where things become open source? And like, I would argue that at the point where something is like recognizable as its entity, like, anything that is cloning it, man, inside of, yeah, it's
let,
hard. It's hard
let
to
me,
even like find the words to talk about.
let me say something I've noticed with, like, maybe it's a cultural thing, maybe it's something in the United States, I don't know. But it seems like mechanisms and functional, like things that could be patented as a, not a design patent, but an actual, like a liner lock, a frame lock, an axis lock,
Right.
things like this. It seems like if it hasn't been patented, or if the patent has run out, it seems like people are very okay as customers and as just general consumers with that being used by other people.
Yeah.
But to me, what seems like the real friction point is design from an aesthetic standpoint.
Yeah. Aesthetic
It seems
design.
seems like aesthetics are way more important to people from an intellectual property standpoint.
Yes.
And it's like, people don't really legally protect that stuff. They
Right.
usually just kind of rely on, like, people not being willing to interfere with that, I
Right.
guess.
Yeah.
Why do you
And
think
you
that
have
is?
this too. You have like this artist mindset and you have the business mindset, right? And the business mindset, a lot of times, I think, looks at this discussion and says, well, it's not patented, so I can do whatever I want. And the
Mhm.
artist mindset says, like, I want to respect like the origins of something or like a style, because you realize like there are certain elements that if you take and put on a knife, it instantly feels like someone else's knife,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Like, you could take details and like make something feel like a lot of makers, right? Like, you
Yeah.
could make a knife and it would feel like a Shirogorov because
Yeah.
you could utilize surface texturing and these like kind of elements that at the end, even if it's not like a one-to-one, it just feels that way.
Mhm.
That's why this one-to-one thing is so mind-blowing to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
To not be able to look at something and go, those are all of the same lines assembled in the exact same way at the same scale. You can't see that. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing that it happens, honestly, because as a designer myself, maybe I put more weight on it than most, but it's like, I'm probably falling prey, like I said, to the culture, but like the aesthetic of something has a human characteristic, and it
Yes.
feels like identity theft in a way. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I really try to think deeply about that, because I'm like, how cultural is that, or how, like, actually, how human is it versus how regional is that?
Yeah.
Because you also, if you look at, like, cars, people get really mad if a car looks like another car. It's the same
Right.
thing in the car industry. But it's like, if a company comes out with, they ditch, like, Ford started ditching V8s and going to turbo V6s. Like,
Right.
that was kind of their thing. And now other companies are doing it. People don't seem to, like, get upset about that.
No.
And it's like, you could make the case that that's the same thing, but then most people, they see the shape of the mirror, the shape of like the wheels and
Yeah.
the way they did the grill, like it's too similar. Like people are really territorial about that.
Yeah, and
Do you?
that's something as small as a grill. If you take this to logo design, it's the same thing. Like if you see the Nike swoosh, like there's only so close that you could get to that as another brand without people being like, "What are you trying to be Nike?"
Mhm.
So I think the comparisons here are sometimes like this. Yeah, this visual component of like understanding like the origins of a design and just realizing like humans actually do care.
Mhm.
Like we can tell the difference, right?
Yeah.
It's just strange to me that I think in this case too, something that really bothered me is like the way that their website is presented. They talk like they are creating these unique
It
designs.
If anybody listening to this, just go to williamsknifeco.com. Like, yuck. Just the like the way they're talking about, they've got pictures of designing, quote unquote. They've got
Yeah,
pictures of
like
like
hand to paper,
we're we're
these unique
we're
artworks and
inspired by the outdoors to be this unique original. I mean,
yeah,
it's very contradictory to reality.
right.
So it's not like when I see a clone on, eBay, I don't look at it and see this like banner waving of like we're this, American blue collar,
No,
you
it's
know,
like popping up
m-
on Alibaba
yeah.
or
And
like eBay.
it's kind of like a wink and a nod, like I
Yeah,
know what you're doing. It's like, yeah, it is what it
nameless,
is.
faceless,
Yeah, and
right?
that's why I usually
Yeah,
kind of ignore that because I'm like, whatever, they're doing what
same.
they're doing. But with this, it's like, don't pretend, right?
Yeah,
The pretending is what is
yeah.
it's
Well,
rough.
just show respect. I
Yeah.
think that that's a big one, right? And like, is respect owed? Like, not really. Like, why does this guy need to get back to anybody who he's copied? I guess like from a legal standpoint, like he's probably making a good decision. Like, I don't know. I'm just not. I'm just like not okay
Yeah.
with it. And
Yeah.
again, like this conversation, like for me, is not so much about their company, just as like a larger conversation kind of around like as makers and designers, like where are you obligated to like show respect and to like not borrow heavily from other ideas,
Mhm.
or like
Mhm.
what is the correct way to do that, you know?
Yeah, well, maybe I can ask you about this. I have had designs where, I mean, everybody probably has had designs where if you post it, there's usually somebody saying something like, "Well, that looks like XYZ. That kind of looks
Right.
like that's just very common." Like there's a lot of
Yep.
people that see that. I have had times where I didn't agree,
Yeah.
but maybe two people said the same thing, that it looked like X knife.
Yeah.
I would actually I have before reached out to that designer to show
Yep.
it to them and be like, "Look, two or three people have said this.
Yep.
I want to just completely honest gauge, like, what's your opinion? Because I don't want there to be, this bad air, like from a designer to a designer. Like, do you feel like they're right?
That this is too
Yeah,
close. Yeah.
and I've done that before.
Yeah, so have I. And I've had a lot of makers reach out to me and like ask if something is too close. And like the reality is, what I think I would say 95% of the time someone is saying like this looks like something else. I actually disagree,
Hmm.
right? Because they're basing it off of a single feature or some type of like it's like curvature or something. And
Hmm.
you're like, yeah, but everything past like this is different. Is it so? Does that make me right? I don't
Hmm.
know. Right. I think it's something that like anytime someone says like this looks like something else, it's worth looking at.
Hmm.
And again, like on the designer to designer scale, I absolutely think open communication is just
Yeah,
like key.
yeah,
Right. Like
and
I
I
usually know if I'm getting too close to some other design. Like I'll design something and I'll be like, man, this is weird. This like, okay, this doesn't look like me. Or this is starting to like, what is this feeling like?
yeah, like you're channeling something you saw a little bit
Channeling
more than
something
you
that you
wish you
think
were.
is
Yeah,
yeah, that you
yeah.
think is cool.
Yeah, yeah, I've had that happen, and I will say reaching out to other designers the couple times I've done that have been good experiences. So it's like I
Yeah,
think
same.
it's usually it's usually the right thing to do. I think is just to have that conversation so that
Yeah.
there's nothing left unsaid. I guess. Um, yeah, it's an interesting thing because I I I think with design, almost anything in general, you always hear the trope of like simpler is better, like simpler is hard, like,
Yeah.
but once you have gotten to a point where you can't remove anything, then you're done.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
there's all these phrases about this. I do tend to agree with that in a lot of ways, but like it's like if you give people a very limited amount of resources to make this thing. So it's like a simple knife is only going to have like 8 lines, right?
Right.
It's like then you can only do so much of those 8 lines. And I've thought many times before that it's like the more lines that you have to work with, the easier it is to be unique.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so it makes me wonder, like, are we all captured by this mindset that we should have the fewest possible lines and
Right.
it's creating more friction than there needs to be? Like, or
Here,
should we?
here's another one too. Like, look at the 4-inch Loveless Hunter. At what point did it become okay for people to start making 4-inch Loveless Hunters?
Right.
Because it's a style in and of itself. Those knives are clones. I would argue that like a lot of the clones, man, how do you? Yeah, this is like a really, this is like so broad spectrum,
Hmm.
right? Where it is a very recognizable knife that was basically taken on by like a generation of makers as like a
Hmm.
standard.
Hmm.
I don't know the history of like, was that okay with Bob Lovelace?
Yeah.
Was it that he had enough people who worked for him that made those knives that worked under him that it actually became like its own style,
A genre in and
a
of itself.
genre of
Yeah.
knife?
Yeah.
This is not what we're talking about, right? Like we're talking about a single company taking a design and presenting it as their own.
Hmm.
Um,
It's well, it's interesting because if you look at like the ABS kind of forging world, it's like
yeah,
they have almost like a portfolio of patterns that they all go from in a lot of ways, and
a
it's
lot of right, a lot of
and I
people, yeah,
and I don't mean that in any way critical. I'm just saying
right.
like the culture is that we're recreating existing designs
Do you think that's
in
because a lot of it's from a historical
is
context?
yeah, it's like historical recreation is like a little
Right,
bit of the vibe there.
right,
And I respect it. I mean, I think it's cool. And like my dad being a saddle maker, he'll do and bit and spur makers, silversmiths that he's friends with, like they do a lot of what they do is like it feels a little bit like historical recreation with like a
right.
new spin. And so it's very similar to that ABS mindset. But it seems like in the manufacturing side of what we're doing, because we aren't like calling back to this historical precedent, it's like
Right,
it needs to be 100% new. It's kind of
right.
like the
Or you're creating, I mean, this is the thing, like you're creating genre, right?
yeah.
Like you have, and like I'm all over the place design wise. So I have like aesthetics that are different.
Hmm.
But I can, like if you look at the knives I have with CRKT, I can design inside of that kind of sphere of like,
Hmm.
tuna, squid, like they use this like common design language. They're not copies of each other. They're similar. Someone could easily design a knife inside of that kind of design language. And like, I
Hmm.
wouldn't say anything,
Hmm.
right? That's not, man, it's so broad. I think too, like it depends on industry. Like the overland industry, like I watch, there are so many like one-to-one copies of products. Like I've got a Prinsu rack on my Tacoma. After Prinsu came out, like all of these other companies just released like the exact same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're like, how is that okay?
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
a great idea. It's a really cool concept. And like at this point, I mean, everybody makes one. You're like, where was the conversation that happened around that? Am I just like so like naive or like old fashioned that I'm like, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't take it because it
Yeah.
belongs to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask you this: like, we have a designer background, both of us. So
Yep.
we have a strong emotional connection to design and the ethics with design.
Right.
Could we be wrong? Could we
Absolutely.
could we be in a cultural capture in like as a designer framed mindset of like what makes us own something that we brought to the world when it may have just been an amalgamation of something else, which you know what I mean? It's like it's
Yeah.
how much do we really own it? You know what I mean?
No, I get what you're saying. And like the, at the end of the day, like if you can't defend it in court, I guess it doesn't play. I don't necessarily choose to run my business that way or
Mhm.
interact with other humans that way. Right.
Mhm.
Doesn't make me right. It's just the way that I choose to operate.
Yeah. So my operation mindset, and you touched on it a little bit, is like the reason I try to ignore all these things is like if your business model is to clone or to follow or to absorb pre-existing things and create them either cheaper or faster or just rebrand them for your own thing, like that puts you in a position by default to be in second place forever.
Yeah.
And so if I'm being cloned, that means I must be in first place. And
Sure.
I'm not trying, that's not like an ego statement. I'm just
No,
saying
no.
when I'm being cloned, that means I must be leading in some way,
In
a
some way. Yep.
movement. And so it's like if someone's cloning me, I want to be on to the next thing
Right.
and I'm therefore a step ahead.
Right.
And so it's like I've tried to maintain the mindset of like try to care as little as possible
Yeah.
about these clones. And so this Williams Knife Co. one, this is the first time I've ever talked really publicly about this kind of stuff.
It's because it's
It
an American company.
Yeah,
Normally, we see
yeah.
clones from overseas and it pops up on eBay, and you're like, ugh, that's annoying. But you
Mhm.
know, it doesn't affect your business. You know, it doesn't affect, you know, the visibility of like what you make.
Yeah,
This one is actually just like
yeah,
dirty
yeah.
because,
It it's it the best word I can think of is it's just like it feels gross. It's
yeah,
icky,
super
icky.
gross.
It's just
Yeah.
icky.
Yep.
And that's what made me think about it is like the disingenuous again, like if you're selling clones on eBay, you know what you're doing, we know what you're doing. It's actually honest in a way that it's like I'm cloning knives and selling them on eBay. That's what they're doing. But
Right.
this guy it's like the honesty is there's no honest thievery going
Yeah.
on.
There's no
You know
honest
what I mean?
thievery. Right.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, it's just gross.
Yeah. And so, but I digress. Like I said, I want to be cloned in a sense because
Because it means that your models are so successful and that they are in like the spotlight that someone is taking the time to copy them.
right. And
Is
that
do I read that right?
right. And
Yeah.
but that mindset requires me to keep moving though because
Yeah.
the only way that detracts from my business is if I eventually stop designing new things, then suddenly I'm stuck where they are. But if I continue to move forward, I'm never where they are. I'll always be ahead.
Yeah.
You know what I
Well,
mean?
and that, I mean, like in the years that I've done this, like I have had points where I don't feel like I'm moving forward, like I'm just
Mhm.
working.
Mhm.
And those are the times where when another maker comes too close, I feel it.
Mhm.
Right? If something is successful and a maker gets really close, or I can see that it's derivative, that's where I've experienced frustration. And early on, I think that I was more prone to like reach out, have conversations. Like I called at least one, or I tried to talk to a company that had basically taken the Kwaiken at that point and like they cut the tip off and like changed like the pivot.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's like a 1-to-1, like you could overlay it and you're like, it's the same knife. You just like cut the tip off.
Mhm.
And it was super frustrating. But what I realized, I was more frustrated that they wouldn't talk to me about it.
Mhm.
And I think that company is gone, and that's great and delightful. And, you know, probably because of business practices, but like I'm always willing to have the conversation. And I've stepped in for other companies that I've seen like makers go after because I understand this process of like they may have just picked up a knife and added it to their line without knowing.
Mhm.
Doesn't make it right, but how they handle it after the fact is like what's important to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I think
Sure.
that's probably like semi unique just because like you and I have a different access point like to the manufacturing and like mass market side of our industry. We're not just on the custom side.
Mhm.
So you kind
Yeah.
of get to see it from both, you know, views.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is a good point that because like in the custom side, it's like you can't meet your demand. So if other
Right.
makers start doing something similar,
Yeah.
it's like they're not really taking something out of your pocket. But if you design something for CRKT and another big fish does the same thing, like it actually does kind of be like,
It's frustrating.
it's actually
Right.
competing. It
Yeah.
actually
And
is.
again, I don't for me a lot of times like I want visual recognition. So if I have a design I want that design to exist as long as possible without things that are too close, because what happens is it starts to get diluted,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the origins get diluted. Obviously, that has a timeline. Like we only get so long, but like as a designer and a maker, I want to try and give anything that I create as long of a trajectory as
Mm-hmm.
possible.
But is it possible, let me ask you this, that when you have a dilution, so like let's say you design a knife, it in some way changes the whole industry to where there's a whole new genre and
Yeah.
there's all these people competing in that genre that are
Yeah.
all derivative in some way.
Right.
To me that I'm conflicted because it almost feels to me like that is a thing on your resume that's actually
Oh, I
good,
totally agree.
right? Because
Yeah.
it's like if you look at some famous designer over the last 50 years, it's like you can probably find their genre that would never have existed without them,
Yeah.
and the people that know,
Yeah.
and it's like if I ended up at the end of my career having like this trail of genres that were
Yeah.
from my work that like you might look at and say like they're all cloning and copying and like fighting, sharks being sharks.
Sure.
But it's like, but if even some people could point and be like, oh, I know where that genre came from, like to me, part of me is attracted to that in a weird way.
100%. I feel exactly the same way. I actually think that as a kind of an overarching career goal, that's even reasonable, right?
Hmm.
And this is why it's a complicated emotion.
Yeah.
I also like the idea that I can, if I design something that so inspires someone else that they're like, oh, this is my style. So like, okay, Walter Brand like was a maker that when I first started making, like the way that his grinds curved legitimately kind of blew my mind. All of my knives had curved grinds, right? Kind of same with like when I came in with Ken Onion, where it's like these compound recurves, these
Hmm.
shapes where I was like, I need to be able to like work within that context.
Yeah.
But the knives are not copies either, right? So I look at it, I think you have to be like pragmatic about just kind of like, okay, this is inspired by, if you have enough visibility, you're going to inspire people and you have to be okay with that. Like I would much rather have that on my resume. Like, yeah, like I brought some more people into the industry, or like I gave them some direction, because I've had that. Like I've had
Hmm.
makers that have given me direction, you know?
Let me ask you this. Here's just a question. So you can walk into some gas stations, convenience stores, they've got knives. I like glancing at them because half the time I'm like, well, Can Onion,
Yeah.
like
Yeah, you see
Richard
friends.
Rogers, like you can just see like where those are coming from, and this is no secret.
Yep.
I don't know if you have yet, but when you look, at least for me, it's like I want to kind of see like, is there any of mine in there? I- If you have had that happen where you saw
Yep.
your design in a gas station at that level, like 4.99,
Yep.
you know, how did it make you feel, or how would it make you feel if that hasn't happened?
Uh Closest I've probably gotten to that. So I actually have seen my knives in gas stations, like production knives being sold like in gas stations,
But
which
like
is
your
interesting.
actual
But the
legit ones.
actual knife,
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
I've seen one knife on a gas station attendant that I designed, and that was awesome. But what you're asking, like
Clones.
4 years
Yeah.
ago, I saw $10 Kwaiken flippers, 100% clone, different packaging. Retail was $10. It's crazy. I bought one.
So how did it make you feel though?
That one, I mean, it's nice because I was so separated from it. You just realize I'm like, that for me is like, if I've ever designed anything that had a ripple, I think that knife was
Yeah.
probably it. So that knife
Yeah.
had a ripple.
If
Cool.
I have yet to see that level, like where I literally am in a gas station and I see my design getting
Yep.
copied at that level, I think I'd be so stoked.
Right.
Honestly, I think it would put a huge smile on my
Yep.
face, because of the feeling that like that. Think of the giant trajectory of this design
Yeah.
for it to get here. Because
Yeah.
guess what? It's next to. It's next to a Ken Onion design.
Right.
Why is that there? It's because
Right.
he's Ken Onion. You
They're
know what I mean?
icons. Yeah.
So it's like that. It's like almost a resume thing to be like they're copying me to the extent that they are literally putting these in all the flying J's in the country.
Yeah.
And it's
Totally.
like that's cool to me, even
Yeah.
though it's slimy. But like that puts a smile on my face if it were to happen. But that's to circle back, like with the Williams knife. The reason that doesn't put a smile on my face is it's like it's the pretending to be a real knife company, whereas like a gas station knife, everybody knows they're not
Right.
pretending anything.
Yeah.
But if I saw the gas station knife at Blade Show on someone's table
Yeah.
and they were like, we're this blue collar American brand, like rah rah, I'd be like,
Yeah.
shut up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so that's
Yeah.
where
How
I'm
could
at.
you not
Yeah.
acknowledge?
It's
right?
it's mostly the branding that bothers me about the way
Agreed.
this went down. It's mostly
Agreed.
the branding.
Yeah. So I guess we got feelings involved in this, and that's like,
Yeah.
it's not purely business.
Yeah.
Right. But that, I mean,
Yeah.
that, I don't know, that feels normal anyway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think this is like, as an experience at this point, it's another, like, just, I don't know, another point where you can stop and look at it and be like, okay, like, where does my inspiration come? What do I consider too close? How does my brand operate? And I think that if I had like an ask of like, customers or like newer makers, it would be like, figure out why you like what you like and like where it came from. Like, do you have a style that is what you consider like your style and it's like specific? Like, who was the first person who did that? Like, just know like the roots of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The historical precedent is something that I want to know. Like when people talk
Totally.
about, I remember the first time I ever heard about Bob Terzuola,
Yep.
and they started listing off his credibility and like his history and,
Yep.
Kydex,
Yep.
G10, things that
Yep.
it's like so ubiquitous now.
Yeah. Thumb
And
discs.
Yeah. and it's like almost unbelievable. And so it's like for him, I hope he feels this way. He seems like a very intelligent guy and a well-rounded guy. I bet he's pretty stoked to see that this has infected the whole industry, like G10 and Kydex,
Right.
And it's like, I would love for something that I do to be like that, and it's like,
Totally.
it's such a tricky thing to think about, like copying and influence.
But so using Bob as an example, if you make a copy of the ATCF, right, everyone's gonna know it's Bob's knife.
Mm-hmm.
It's a liner lock. It's a frame lock. It's what we consider like, okay, it's a tactical folder, but it's Bob's tactical folder.
Yeah.
And it's recognizable. If another company comes out with an ATCF, it's instantly recognizable.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah, and that's back to that thing of like we value the artistic signature so highly. And I think that's correct. I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate, but I think
Totally.
that's I agree with that.
Where does that, like, I guess ultimately it leaves us with a position that is not defendable from a legal standpoint, but is like a guiding light of how we conduct our business. That's a trip.
Yeah, for sure.
I didn't go to business school.
Right.
I guess.
Me neither. Yeah, it's a fun, it's a salty topic, but it's kind of fun to talk about because it has implications, right? It makes there's some hard questions that you have to think about when you think about, I mean, there's clones that are clones that are clones. And then there's like the gray area. And it's like, to even talk about the gray area, you kind of have to dig into some hard questions.
Well, I think you and I try to like stay pretty positive too. And that's why this conversation, like both of us are like, oh, do we like talk about this? I think there's so little worry about the company itself. Like that component of it is like, it's a joke that it prompts a conversation, but it's like almost just like, it's like embarrassing. Like I'm embarrassed for that method of doing business and thinking that like you're doing like you're doing something good or have like a cool company. And like everything comes around. Like people will figure it out. People like, educate themselves. It's been interesting kind of like watching the process because like over the past few days, like they're just playing whack-a-mole because people are coming to me like, dude, like my friend designed that knife, or like, that's an Efros Elder. Like, what are you doing? Ban.
Yeah.
And it's like, at some point you probably have to look at that and be like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
how is this winning? Like, how is this business?
Yeah. the business should work for you and should improve your quality of life. How is that any kind of quality of life to be defending
Yeah.
against an army of people that are like, dude,
Laughing at you.
yeah, yeah,
It's hard.
yeah,
I don't know. So that is, I don't know if we like actually got into like any like theory of like what is too close, what's not too close. You know, you always hear people like say like, you know it when you see it.
yeah. I
I
don't
think
know
as
if I
a
agree.
as a maker, you know
Yeah,
internally when you're too close to something else.
yeah, yeah. It's something to. I think self-regulation is the best solution
Yeah.
for this.
Have you
If
ever designed something and loved it and then had to kill it because you realized that it essentially was like too close to someone else's design?
Yes, but not. I never got it so far in that it was like, oh, I'm prototyping this thing.
Yeah.
I've had very exciting sketches and
Yeah.
like the beginnings of CAD
Sketches.
models.
Yep.
They got like, I'm like, God,
Oh, so good.
yeah. I'm like, yeah, I've had that happen.
Yeah.
And
I
I'm
mean,
sure
I've
it's,
had it a bunch of times, like usually only in sketches. Like I'll be like chasing a line and I'll get somewhere and I'm like, this is awesome. And then I'm like, oh man, like,
yep, yep, yep. Yeah, no, I've had that sneak right in there. But yeah, that's where, like I said, like the self regulation of the designer. I think being the one to go to, if you feel like you've afflicted another person's design,
yeah,
or you've become too close, like I think being the one to reach out, like we should. I don't think we should create an industry of designers that are accusing. I think we should create an
totally.
industry of designers that are especially conscious and being the ones to initiate it if
Just
they feel
communicating.
close.
Yeah.
So it's like if I even, like I said, if I even get a hint that I'm getting close, I try to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
But-
that's good. And
but-
I think like in the past when I've had other makers reach out to me and ask if something was too close or like if they could use like a feature or something, I think overwhelmingly it's been positive.
Yeah. You know what would solve our problem?
What?
If we were really, really cool, like Gavin Hawk.
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
Like
You're just smarter than
Joe
everybody
Caswell,
else. Yeah.
who people look at and they're not cloning shit, dude. They're like, those are new knives. You know what I mean? So
yeah. Yeah, I'm limited. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm easy to knock off.
Right,
Like,
right. We're down here
here's
in
my
the
line.
mud just wrestling, and they're like, yo, check out this morphing karambit, you know, just like,
Oh,
yeah.
that's the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, if I ever bring anything like that out, I'm being derivative.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh. That's funny.
All right. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, is that like, that was good. That was like a little vent.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
Don't be a clown company. Like if you're starting a company, like just be cool. Don't
be
take
legit.
advantage of people. Yeah.
be legit.
Just be legit. If you're a
Yeah.
designer, like do cool
Yeah.
designs.
Yeah. Yep.
Better to have friends.
Be transparent, be legit,
Yeah.
do things the right way.
Communicate.
Communicate.
Right.
It's not that hard, dude. It's a direct like correlation to any other thing you do in life. It's just do it. Just do it.
Find
right.
your own line.
Yeah.
Like we all have
Yeah.
things that we like. Just find what you like and then do that.
Yeah.
And hopefully someone will copy you.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you know. All right. Dude, let's call it. Hey
Good
guys.
stuff.
Thanks for listening.
Appreciate it. You guys
Hopefully
have
that didn't like seem too salty or like whiny, but
Yeah. I wondered. I was thinking about it too. I was like, man, it's like the ivory tower thing of like these designers arguing. I'm like, I was thinking
Yeah.
about that. I'm like, how does this sound?
this is the whole
That-
point. We just wanted to
yeah.
have conversations. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is
Yeah.
a real
Yeah.
conversation.
It's legit, guys.
All right.
Appreciate y'all.
Thanks guys.
Have a good one.